Well, this is not a cue for you to be quiet. It's the name of our series we're in right now called Quiet. And I have this belief that we live in a world where there's a quiet deficit. There's just not a lot of quiet. And before we kind of get into that for the series we're in, I want to talk about another part of our world where I think that there's a deficit, and that's in the area of hope. We live in a world that seems to be lacking hope at times and in places. Some of us are in situations that feel like it's lacking hope. And so because of that, we've decided to do a 4-week series called Living Hope, and we're going to start it in 63 days. And the reason I tell you that is because, one, I think this is an important series we want to leverage for our lives, for our families, for our world, for our friends. But we're doing something kind of different, and we've talked about it once or twice already. In your program, there's a card that looks exactly like this, because printers are pretty consistent. And on the front of the card, it says this. It kind of explains what we're doing, that we're preparing for this Easter season. What we're doing this year is we're not doing an Easter service, we're doing an Easter series. And on Easter, it tends to be a little bit more crowded. We're trying to be very intentional about leveraging this idea of making room. And I tell you, every Easter, you guys, and really every Sunday, you guys do a fantastic job. We have a great first impressions team of people that make people feel welcome and greet. We have a whole church of first impressions greeters. You guys are so great at thinking about others and meeting new people and connecting them and introducing. Well, during that, usually typically Easter Sunday, everyone is a first impressions person. Everyone's a greeter, just like most Sundays. But one of the challenges we're having is we're running out of room. Like if you look around the room right now, the room's pretty full. You'd be surprised at how many chairs are in here. There's more than you think. But something in us, when seats start to fill up in a room like this, we stop inviting. I still have friends who need hope. I still have friends who need Jesus. I still have friends who need hope and help in a lot of areas of life. But we tend to be less invitational, one, when we're okay, or when a room is full like this. And so what we want you to do is for 4 weeks, April 21st, April 28th, May 5th, and May 12th, that's Mother's Day. In between Easter and Mother's Day, we're going to do 3 services for 4 weeks. We usually do that at Easter. We're going to do it for 4 weeks. One, we want to make room. We've grown 80% since August of 2015, and it's filled up a lot of chairs. And our goal is not to just fill up a room. Our goal is to connect people to Christ and community. We want people connected to the living hope, who is Jesus, to know how they can be living hope each and every day in their life. And so for 4 weeks, we're going to try and leverage that. So on the back of the card, there's 2 things that would be very helpful to know to you, for us to know, for you to tell us. And what I want you to do is I want you to pull it out, find a pen nearby, because I want you to kind of give some feedback. The first question is, if you knew which service you're going to attend most weeks during that series, we would like to know. One, it helps us prepare. And so if you could just circle 8:30, 10, or 11:30, you do not have to put your name on this to tell us this. You're not making a reservation. It doesn't guarantee you a seat. It's not StubHub. We're not, it doesn't mean you can't change your mind. It's just giving us an idea. That's a little bit more helpful than, hey, raise your hands if you're doing this, this, or this. And if you could do that, that would be very helpful. And then below that, it says, if you might be willing to serve, you're not committing to it, might be willing to serve in kids ministry during our Easter series, those 4 weeks, and all during those 4 weeks, please provide your name and your email, and then someone will be in contact with you. We can only do this if we do this. And so, like I said, it seems early to be talking about Easter. There's 7 more Sundays before Easter Sunday. There's 63 days between now and then. But because especially the biggest challenge for us is our kids ministry environments, because it's one of our most strategic environments. But it takes a lot of volunteers to do kids ministry well. The promise that we make to you and to anybody is we will always do our best to serve kids and families well. The next generation for us is a priority and a mission field. And so for those 4 Sundays, we'll require a lot of extra help in kids ministry, both in Acorn Club, preschool, babies up through preschool, and then 4s and 5s, and then over here, kindergarten through 5th grade. Here's the deal. This is our plan. 3 services for 4 weeks. Because we value kids ministry, parents, and volunteers, if we don't have the volunteers, we won't do 3 services for 4 weeks. That's a next step. That might be not the time we take that next step. I sure hope it is, because I think it's needed. I think it's a necessary next step. We will learn a lot from doing this, and we can leverage this a lot for good opportunities. But if by St. Patrick's Day, we don't have at least 75% of our volunteers in place for kids ministry because they need to be background checked, onboarded, that kind of thing, we wouldn't just throw someone into kids ministry for the volunteers' sake, for the kids' sake, and for the parents' sake. Because it takes some onboarding, we really feel like we don't have 63 days. We feel like more like we have 30 days. So in the next 30 days, if you think that might be you, one of those people that can fill in that gap during kids ministry, serving in kids ministry, let us know. You're not committing to it, but at least it helps our kids ministry know who to have conversations with. That's one of also the challenges of growing larger. People just don't know as many people to say, hey, would you mind serving? It's not always as easily done word of mouth, but that's always best. But if you can fill that out, what I want like each of you to do is to fill this out, and you're going to pass the cards in just a minute, in 2 minutes, so write fast, but all you have to do is circle and maybe write your name and email if you're willing to have a conversation. And then in about 2 minutes, the ushers are going to come down and just pass it in. If you don't get it done in time, you'd like to do it later, just drop it in an offering station as you leave. All this to say is this. We believe those 4 weeks could be very strategic in the life of our church and in the lives of some individuals. And so if you know which service you're going to attend, that will help us understand how it's playing out. If I was a speculating type person, I would guess 8:30 and 10 will be the heaviest attended. 11:30 will be the lighter one, especially on Easter. But I don't know, but you might give us a better idea. You know, right now, we have a lot of spots to fill in terms of people who are served. And again, if I was thinking about where will most people serve, probably at the 10 o'clock because it's right in the middle. Or maybe 8:30 because toddlers and youngsters tend to get up earlier. 11:30, it's lunch plans and things like that. There's hockey games to watch and things like that. You know, you want to get going. I get that. But here's our decision. That if we're not kind of about 75% of the slots filled by March 20th, right after St. Patrick's Day, we'll probably just do 3 services for Easter and then 2 services the rest of the way. And that'll tell us something about we're just not there yet in terms of our volunteer base of getting where it needs to be. But we don't want to put kids, volunteers, or for parents, have an environment where we're understaffed. And we don't want to put volunteers in a place where they're not prepared. We think kids matter to Jesus because, man, there's this great, we're in this series about quiet, and we're going to talk about listening today, how that's so necessary. Like, Jesus listened to people so well. And there's this great, scene in his life where these people very important people are coming and talking to him, but all of a sudden these kids, somehow they got under the rope or found a way in, and all of a sudden they're gathered around Jesus, and his disciples are trying to push him away, and he said, no, let the little children come unto me. Like, Jesus listened to everybody, including kids, and kids were not valued in that culture, but they were by Jesus. He listened to them well. And so we want to create an environment where kids are valued, and the people that express value to kids are small group leaders, of hosts, of kids ministry worship team, and tech booth people, and service coordinators, all those people who rock babies. The babies may not be able to say thank you, but the moms and dads do. Because that's a tough thing to entrust your baby to somebody. So if there's any of those roles that you would like to serve, hear more about, write it on there. If you could tell us what service it is. And even if you didn't fill out a card, make me think that you did, and pass it down blank, and put it in the basket when you leave. Sound good? And if you want to hang on to it and turn it into the service, you can do that. But if the ushers will come down now, if you could pass it to the inside rows. So that way, that way, that way, and that way. I don't know. Pass it to an in row. Hey, as you're doing that, let me kind of go into what we're talking about today, this idea of quiet. Like I said, our world has a quiet deficit, but quiet is necessary. And the question we're asking is, what if being quiet actually speaks the loudest? Kind of the main idea in this series we've been saying is we have this God-given need for quiet, for stillness, and for solitude. We need it for ourselves. Last week, Mark did an excellent job talking about how we need this to hear from God well. He asked the question, what if God speaks loudest when I'm quietest? That it's necessary for hearing from God. Well, today I want to talk about another reason that quiet is so important. There's a guy named Eric Weihenmayer, and I may be pronouncing his name wrong, and I feel bad about that if I do, because it's an amazing guy. When he was 13 years old, he had a degenerative eye disease and lost his eyesight. But on May 25th, 2001, he reached the peak of Mount Everest. He's blind. And he did what very few people did. It's a mountain where 90% of the climbers never make it to the top. 165 people have died trying since 1953, but Eric succeeded, and in large part, it was because he listened well. He listened to the climbers in front of him, the climbers in front of him who had a bell on their backpack, and he would follow the sound of the bell. The guys behind him and in front of him would shout out instructions. 2 feet to your right is a death fall. He listened to that well. He had an ice pick that he would chip at the ice as he went, almost like a blind man's cane. But he would listen to the sound of the ice to know the integrity of the ice and navigated himself up the mountain. Listening well was life or death for him. And when listening means something, we tend to lean in. Like all of a sudden, if you realize, hey, I've got to listen to this, or I'm going to lose my place in line. I'm going to miss out on something. I'm going to miss out on winning something. Like there are times in life where we know, like, I've got to listen well and lean in. If you're waiting to get on a flight where it's the last flight out and your flight was canceled and you're listening for names to be called and the airport's noisy and all of a sudden they call out a name. Wait, did they say Doug Holcomb? Like that's my, if I get on that flight, I get home. If not, like suddenly there's times we lean in. But most of the time in life, I don't know if we have a lot invested in listening well. But yet it's not life or death because we're not climbing Mount Everest. But it means something. It matters. And we have a God-given need for quiet with each other to connect to each other well. As a matter of fact, the thing I want to say today is this, that quiet listening is needed to love others well. We need quiet in our lives to hear others. Sometimes we need quiet around us, but really, I'm talking about quieting ourselves. Because quiet listening is needed to love others well. And there's a difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is simply the act of perceiving sound through your ear. And if you're not hearing impaired, hearing simply happens. If someone makes a noise, you hear it. Sorry if I woke up some of you. I apologize. Listening, however, is something that you choose to do. It's a conscious decision to lean in, to concentrate, to try and focus not just your eyes, your ears, your body, and your mind, to really process the meaning of what's being spoken or the sounds that are happening. And the Bible has a lot to say about the value of quiet and quiet listening. Ecclesiastes 3:7 says this, "There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens, including the activity of a time to be silent and a time to speak." And I think if we lean more one way or the other, we probably lean more to speaking rather than being silent. And it's interesting that those are opposed to each other because it almost implies if the silence is listening. But even if it doesn't, we know that it's important. The book of Proverbs, the book of wisdom, has a ton to say about listening. Proverbs 18:13. To answer before listening, that's folly and shame. Proverbs 17, verses 27 and 28. The one who has knowledge uses words with restraint. And whoever has understanding is even-tempered. And here's a tip if you want to sound like you're a smart person in your next meeting. Even fools are thought wise if they keep silent. discerning if they hold their tongues. You want to feel like you're smart in a meeting? Don't talk. Just listen. The minute you open your mouth, sometimes I think when I do, I tip my hand. Oops, I just said something. Now they know I'm not the smartest person in the room. Proverbs 19:20 says this, listen specifically to advice and accept discipline. How well do you do that on a scale of 1 to 10? How well do you listen to advice and accept discipline? Because it says if you do that, at the end, you'll be counted among the wise. If you want to grow wise, it will involve listening. Not just hearing, but listening. Both. Proverbs 12:15, the way of fools seem right to them, but the wise listen to advice. There's something about the humility of saying, I may not have my act together. I may not have full understanding in this. I will listen. And if you think you're right, be careful. Proverbs 12:15 says you might be the fool. If you want to grow in wisdom, listen to advice. Proverbs 19:27, stop listening to instruction, my son, and you will stray from the words of knowledge. The minute we stop listening, we start leaving things that are wise. Proverbs 10:19, sin is not ended by multiplying words. Or to flip that around, the more you talk, the more sin has an opportunity. But the prudent hold their tongues. Proverbs 18:2, fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions. How well do you listen? Like I said earlier, Jesus was great at listening, but he aired his opinions. But when people heard it, they didn't recognize he taught with authority. At the same time, here's this guy teaching with authority, had much to say, could draw a crowd, but he listened well. One night, it was late at night, and this guy named Nicodemus came up to him, started asking questions that people in his position as a religious leader shouldn't be asking of a guy like Jesus. But he was curious because he felt like Jesus had it right, and maybe he didn't. And he was trying to understand, how exactly do you enter the kingdom of heaven? How does this whole thing work? And Jesus listened to all his questions. There were other people who had the same office and position as a religious leader that Nicodemus had, but yet when they came to him, he would call them, hey, you're being foolish, you're blind, you're leading people astray, you're a hypocrite. But with Nicodemus, he stopped and he leaned in and listened. And he valued Nicodemus. There was a guy one time that came up and he had really done everything he could to build his religious resume. He tried to do everything exactly right. And he came and he asked Jesus, he goes, am I lacking anything? And Jesus, because he kind of had an insider information because he's God, and he recognized this guy loved money and himself more than anything. And he said, go sell everything you have. And the guy said, I can't. But Jesus patiently listened as this guy tried to find a loophole. But finally, Jesus spoke the truth in love and said, go sell all you have. Let go of what has a hold of you. And the guy walked away, and it broke Jesus' heart. There was a woman one time who'd been caught in relationship after relationship after relationship as someone who was abused and doing the wrong things, and she was just in this cycle, and she comes to see Jesus. Jesus talks with her. He singles her out. And that was not a cultural thing. But he esteems her with value, and he listens to her, and he sees what's going on, and then he says, go and sin no more. But he puts value on her life. Another time Jesus is thirsty, he goes to a well, typically at a time of day when most people weren't there, but this one woman went. Similar story, relationship after relationship after relationship that wasn't good. And he recognized this person was kind of trying to hide in life. But he saw her and he listened to her. Jesus listened so well. He listened to kids when they came and talked to him. He listened to people with diseases, people who were written off. He listened to people who thought they had it all together and people who knew they didn't. He listened well. Jesus was the consummate listener. He still is. And Jesus' brother James, who wrote this book of the Bible called James, has this to say about listening. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this, almost as if he knows that we don't do this well. Everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak. He kind of put some speed limit signs up. Be very quick to listen. Be slow to speak. Most of us, I'll kind of self-report and say I'm guilty of this. I am slow to listen and quick to speak. And we have to flip the script. He adds this added benefit that when you do that, you're slow to become angry. It's this independent choice, but I think it's related to those. Because if you're quick to listen to others and you're slow to speak, your temper will slow down as well. But there's this idea that we need to be quick to listen and slow to speak. How well do you do at that? I think it's interesting that the context of this is the very next thing he says is our ability to listen to God's word and God's truth in our lives. And I think there's a relational dynamic that he's talking about how we listen to others, but then he talks about how we listen to God's instructions, which might come from each other or come from God's holy word. It could come from a lot of different places. Let me ask you this. If you're not as quick to listen and slow to speak as you think you could be, what are the enemies of listening for you? What keeps you from quiet listening? For many of us, it's busyness or an agenda. Sometimes there's distractions. Sometimes there's a lack of interest, lack of humility, selfishness, pride. There's all kinds of things that can cut the feet out and short circuit our ability to be quick to listen and quietly listen to others. But I really believe if God wants us to love him with everything we have and love others as we love ourselves, quiet listening is needed to love others well. Listening simply means to focus on what the other person is saying with your ears, your eyes, your body, and your mind, including your memory. Making the person, at least trying to help the person feel valued. Our ears is where we listen, and then we go the extra mile and we hear. Where we hear and go the extra mile and listen. Eyes are the windows to the soul, and so when someone has your eyes, it typically means they have your attention. When there's eye contact. If you've ever heard the term body language, body is how we carry ourselves as a form of communication. It says something, and it speaks. Even without saying a word, how you position yourself matters. With your mind focusing internally, and with your memory, the ability to remember and respond and recall what someone has said to you. Has anyone ever come back and said, hey, last week you were telling me about something, how's that going? It communicates value because they remembered. It didn't just go in one ear and out the other. When we love others well, it usually means that we've listened well. As a matter of fact, there's this idea in the Bible of these things called one another's. 100 times this Greek word alelon is in the Bible that talks about one another, how we should be with one another. Love one another, serve one another, encourage one another, teach one another, build one another up. All these one another's, 47 unique one another's, 100 times in the New Testament. Well, I believe that quiet listening is needed to one another well. Galatians 5:13 is a great example. It says this, you, my brothers and sisters, if you're a follower of Jesus, this is you, we're called to be free. That's what God's called you to be, is free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. That selfish, self-centered, old part of what God has saved you from, the flesh. Rather, the alternative of that is to serve one another humbly in love. And there's that word, one another. And it has a couple of these one another things. It's a great summary verse. Serve humbly in love. That's how we should be with each other. Well, quiet listening is needed to love one another well, to one another well. And the thing is, there's like I said, there's about 47 unique one another verses. More like 37, 38 if you kind of get down to the ones, because some of them are in there, it's kind of more just kind of casual interaction. Some of them it's kind of different culture. Greet one another with a holy kiss. We're not talking about that. I can get out there really weird kind of fast. But these verses about love one another, teach one another, serve one another, confess your sins to one another. Well, that's uncomfortable. Let's go back to that holy kiss thing. Like that can be awkward. But there's all these one another verses that you read these, and he says, this is what it looks like to do life together as a child of God in the family of God in the kingdom of God. And the problem is, I can't walk around with a one another checklist and go through my list and go, okay, I'm having this connection with somebody. Am I loving one another? Am I serving one another? Am I being humble? You can't go through that list. So we came up with this tool a couple years ago. We did a series on the one another's that can really help frame your moments. And we had this tool because all the one another statements fall in one of these 4 categories. Love one another. Over a third of the one another statements are about loving one another. Humility. A bunch of them talk about the importance of the posture of humility with one another. And then does it promote unity? Building unity. And then building others up. Those are typically the 4 buckets that all these one another's fall in. So if you could just think of these 4, and with every interaction you have, think, and right now, is this expressing love? Is this an act of humility? Am I in a posture of humility? Is it a promoter of unity? And is this building others up based on what I'm saying? Well, if you can use that with your words and actions, it's helpful. But I think if you ran quiet listening through the same thing, it's an expression of the one another's. Because if you're talking to me and I'm listening well, that's a way of loving others well. Unity. Oh, by the way, about love, this guy named Paul Tillich has this great quote. He says, the first duty of love is to listen. That's where it starts. If you want to love others well, listen and notice and pay attention. But then the second one is this act of humility at the bottom there. Am I in a posture of humility? Because if I am, I'm not thinking about, hey, what do I need to say next? I'm thinking about what you're saying next. I'm listening. I'm paying attention. What I'm saying is right now, you're the most important person in the room. Not me, not them, you are. You have my attention. Quiet listening helps you do this. It promotes unity. Quiet listening promotes unity. Remember that proverb about kind of being quiet? Makes sin not multiply. The abundance of words, more sin. Lack of words, less sin. We'll talk more about this next week, but sometimes quiet is needed because some of the words being spoken aren't helpful. They're not true. It doesn't promote unity. It doesn't value others. Like if I just be quiet, my chances of unity being promoted in a relationship, in a family, in a business, on a team, in a school, in a classroom, in a church, in a government, wherever it is, it's greater. And then quiet listening is an opportunity to build others up. Because if I truly want to invest in you, if you truly want to invest in me in a way that builds me up to be the person God created me to be, it will require listening well. To understand where someone is, what's going on. Carol Lawrence says this, people will rarely remember your advice, but they will remember that you listened. People will rarely remember your advice, but they'll remember that you listened. Who will remember at the end of this week that you listened? That you love people well by listening to them? Quiet listening is needed to love others well. This last weekend, I took my kids to Schulenburg, Texas. That's where my great aunt lives. And she'll be 99 in just a few weeks. And my kids had never met her. We adopted our kids 6 years ago. We'd never been down there. She has gone through the process the last 5 years of having to, her husband passed away years ago, my uncle and great uncle, and she had to sell her house, move into an assisted living place, and now she's brand new in a nursing home. And she has to have a roommate. And she's lost everything. In terms of possessions, it's all down into a closet. What used to be a big house that I have fond memories of going and playing there. And I wanted my kids to meet her. But I remember as a kid, going into a nursing home is pretty intimidating. It's just a different world. And so I tried to prepare my kids for it and prepare them to meet my great aunt. And she's in great health. She had polio as a kid, and so her right knee doesn't work very well, and it won't. But other than that, she's incredibly healthy and sharp mind. And I was excited for them to meet her, but I just said, hey, there'll be some people in there that have some real struggles. And I remember as a kid going into a nursing home and someone grabbing my arm and trying to pull me in, and I didn't know who they were, and it kind of freaked me out a little bit, which may be why I've never come to see some of you in the hospital. That's just, I'm not so good in those environments, but I wanted my kids to do well, and so I coached them this way, and I can't remember who told me this when I was younger, and they said, hey, when you go in the nursing home, and I told them this, when you go in the nursing home, if someone looks at you and you look at them, if you make eye contact, smile, say, how are you? And then keep eye contact until they answer. And if they don't answer, that's fine. But if they do, listen and say, well, that's great, or I'm so sorry. Like, you respond in some way. And so I coached them that way. And they did so good. Like my kids are the opposite of quiet. They're loud. But I was like, hey, this is going to be a quiet place. And so we go into this unusual environment or whatever. And we walked in, and they did so good. And we walked in, and right as soon as we walked in, this person kind of wheeled in front of my kids, almost like it was a checkpoint. Kind of wheeled in front of them and kind of looked at them. Didn't say a word, just kind of looked at them. And I was like, and I started to say something, and then one of my kids said, hi, how are you? And I looked at them, and they just kept making eye contact. And the person said, I'm okay. And they said, well, that's good to hear. I hope you have a great day. And I just watched this person, their face just lit up. And then we went in the cafeteria, and everyone was eating in there, and they kept making eye contact and having that same interaction. And I thought, isn't it amazing how eye contact, a little attention, and a smile can change the environment? It can change a relationship. But I think one of the things it does is it changes us, because you were created to be connected to others. And if you don't practice quiet listening, that connection will be somewhat disconnected, superficial, shallow, or lacking. Quiet listening really is needed to love others well. Let's stand for closing prayer. Heavenly Father, thanks that you are the ultimate listener. You listen so well. God, I pray that as we become more like you, and that's what you do, you're transforming us to be more like you. I pray that we be more like you, and one of those ways would be how we listen and value others. The value you place on people is evident because you were willing to die on the cross as an expression of love, mercy, and grace. God, I pray that we would be conduits of you paying attention to others this week. At the end of the week, I pray people would remember that we listened well and we quietly listened in a way that expressed love and value to others. God, help us in that. Eliminate the distractions, internal and external, that keep us from practicing quiet listening. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Hey, in just a few minutes, there'll be several people being baptized. We'd love for you to stick around and cheer them on. Thanks for being here.